The night of their wedding, the Duke of Ashford paused at the threshold of his new wife's chamber and spoke the strangest 4 words she had ever heard from a gentleman. "May I continue in?" He did not sweep through the door as was his right. He did not claim what the law and the church and every contract signed between their fathers had already given him. He stood in the doorway in his evening coat, candle in hand, and he waited. And when Marian looked up from the chair where she sat, still in her wedding gown because she had no maid who knew the buttons, she did not know what to make of a man who asked permission to enter a room that was, by every legal definition, already his. She said yes. He entered. He sat in the chair opposite. He told her, in precise and careful language, that he had no intention of forcing himself on a stranger. And then he told her something else, something that would take her nearly a year to fully understand. He told her the marriage would remain in name only, that he would be leaving for London before dawn, and that she should consider Ashford Manor hers to manage as she saw fit. Because he had no intention of returning. He left before the candle burned down. What happened in the year that followed, what Marian built from the ruin he left her in, and what the Duke discovered when duty finally brought him back, is a story about what it costs a proud man to admit he was wrong, and what it means when a woman refuses to be erased. Marian Halcott had never expected to marry a duke. She had expected, in the quiet arithmetic of her situation, to marry a clergyman or a modest landowner, someone who required a wife of modest means and moderate accomplishment. Someone who would not look too closely at the fact that her father's estate was more debt than stone. She had 23 years, a sharp mind, a plain face she had long since made peace with, and a talent for household economy that she had never been allowed to call by its proper name, intelligence. The Duke of Ashford was 31, widowed, and under the particular pressure of an entail that required him to produce an heir within 3 years or watch his title pass to a cousin he despised. His solicitor had been methodical about it. The bride needed to be of acceptable birth, in good health, and willing to be discreet. Marian met all 3 criteria. Her father, drowning in mortgages, met 1 criteria of his own. He said yes immediately. Marian had met the Duke twice before the wedding. Both times he had been perfectly polite and perfectly absent, the way a man is polite when he has already made a decision and is merely observing the formality of appearing to consider it. He had not been cruel to her. He had not been kind either. He had been efficient, and perhaps that was the thing she found most difficult to forgive in those early days, not the coldness, but the indifference. The wedding was small, held in the parish church nearest her father's house on a grey Thursday in November. The Duke's bouquet had been white roses, and Marian had thought it a strange choice for a marriage that felt so much like a business transaction. White for purity, she supposed, or white for nothing in particular, which was closer to the truth. She arrived at Ashford Manor in the dark. The carriage rattled through a lane overhung with bare elms, and when the house finally appeared it was a long, low shape against a charcoal sky, lit in only 2 of its many windows. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Granger who had the manner of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything good to happen, showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. The fire had been lit, but barely. The room smelled of damp and long absence. She did not unpack. She sat, as she was, in her wedding gown, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was the Duke. He asked, "May I continue in?" She said yes. He sat opposite and told her the arrangement in plain words, the way one reads aloud the terms of a lease. Name only. London before dawn. The manor was hers. She asked one question. The staff, are there sufficient funds for wages? He had looked at her then, for the first time that she felt truly looked at. Something shifted in his expression, though she could not have named what. I will arrange a quarterly account, he said. You will find the estate books in the study. They are not, they are in some disorder. She nodded. He left. She sat for a long time in the chair after the candle burned low. Not weeping. Thinking. The disorder of the estate books, it turned out, was a generous description. In the cold grey light of her first morning at Ashford Manor, Marian carried a candle into the study and found a room that looked as though it had not been properly attended in 3 years since. She calculated, the death of the Duke's first wife. There were ledgers stacked without order, receipts in loose piles, and 2 letters from a London creditor that had been opened and then apparently set aside for consideration that never arrived. She sat down. She opened the first ledger. She read. The estate was not ruined, but it was wounded. The tenant farms had not been properly collected. Several of the house accounts had been doubled in error. The kitchen garden had been allowed to go fallow. The roof over the east wing had been patched in the wrong season and had leaked badly through the autumn. And the damage had crept down into 2 of the upper bedrooms where the plaster was now soft and dark with damp. Mrs. Granger appeared in the doorway at 8:30 with tea she had not been asked for. Marian looked up. How many staff are currently in residence? 7, Your Grace. There was a slight hesitation on the title, as though Mrs. Granger was still deciding whether to believe in Marian's position. 3 below stairs, 2 in the gardens, though Thomas has been ill since October, and myself and Agnes upstairs. Is Thomas receiving any care? Mrs. Granger blinked. He manages as he is able. Send Agnes to me after breakfast, Marian said. And bring me whatever provisions are in the kitchen larder. I want to know what we are actually working with. She said it quietly, without authority she did not yet have, and so it was not an order so much as a statement of what was going to happen. Mrs. Granger went away to do it. Marian drank her tea and returned to the ledger. The weeks that followed were not romantic. They were not even comfortable. The house was cold in a persistent way that went beyond what the fireplaces could address. And Marian discovered that 2 chimneys in the east wing had been partially blocked by a bird's nest that had calcified in the flues. She wore her oldest woolen dress and kept a shawl doubled across her shoulders. She ate at the kitchen table most evenings because the dining room required candles she did not yet feel she could justify. And because the warmth from the range made it the most bearable room after dark. She began with Thomas. She found that a modest knowledge of herbal preparations, learned from a governess her father had not been able to afford for long, was sufficient to address what was a severe chest complaint that had been allowed to linger without care. Warm broths. A poultice. Dry air in his room rather than the damp. Within a fortnight he was back in the garden. And the gratitude in his face when he touched his cap to her in the kitchen yard one morning was worth more than any acknowledgement she had received in years. She renegotiated the terms of an unpaid account with the local merchant, offering a portion in cash and the rest in produce from the kitchen garden once she had restored it. She wrote 2 letters to tenants who had gone 6 months without remittance, the letters courteous but firm, and both responded. She had 1 chimney swept and the other lined, which improved the upper rooms enough that the damp plaster could begin to dry. She was not saving a great estate. She was mending a wounded one, slowly, the way one mends anything, by beginning with the smallest tear first. And no word came from London. She had not expected word. But the silence had its own texture, and on certain nights, particularly when the wind came hard off the northern fields and the old house spoke to itself in creaks and sighs, she felt the strangeness of her position as sharply as a splinter under the skin. She was a wife. She was alone. She was building something in a space that had not been built for her. She kept building. Spring arrived at Ashfern in pieces. The elms along the lane put out their small, pale leaves in early April, and Marian stood in the kitchen garden with mud on her boots and a sketch of what she intended to plant, and she felt, for the first time since November, something that might have been satisfaction. She had hired 2 additional women from the village, seasonal, for the garden work, and had arranged with Thomas to restore the kitchen beds in a system she had read about in an agricultural pamphlet she found in the estate library. The vegetables positioned to support one another through the growing season. She could not have said when she had begun to regard the manor as something to be tended rather than merely endured, but somewhere in the grey of February it had shifted. The house helped, in its way. Ashfern Manor had bones. Good ones. The proportions of the rooms were generous and well considered, and when she opened the shutters in the long drawing room one morning and let the spring light come in, she saw the room for what it was rather than what neglect had made it. She found a set of pale green curtains in a trunk in the attic, not fashionable but clean and well made, and had them hung. She had the floors cleaned properly for the first time in what Mrs. Granger indicated had been several years. She arranged the furniture so the rooms spoke to one another rather than huddling against the walls. "You are making changes, Mrs. Granger observed one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the drawing room with the particular tone of someone who has not yet decided whether to approve. "The house deserves to be lived in," Marian replied. Mrs. Granger was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The first Duchess did not care for this room. She found it cold." "It was cold," Marian said. "The chimney was blocked." Mrs. Granger left. But the following morning there appeared on the kitchen table a tin of biscuits that had not been there before, and Mrs. Granger's expression for the remainder of the day was one of settled decision, as though something had been resolved. It was in May that the matter of the children arrived. The estate had 2 tenant families whose children had, by informal and long-standing arrangement, been educated in the manor's small schoolroom during winter months. This arrangement had apparently ceased with the first Duchess's illness and had not been resumed. Marian discovered this from a conversation with one of the tenants' wives who came to pay a portion of overdue rent and left with her hat somewhat crushed from nervous handling. "My eldest is 8 now," the woman said. "She can read her name and that is all. I don't mean to ask more than is our place. The schoolroom will be open again by October," Marian said. She had no authority to say so. But she said it. She wrote a letter to London that week. It was the first she had written. She informed the Duke, in 3 precise paragraphs, of the current estate accounts, the repairs completed, the garden's projected yield, and her intention to reopen the schoolroom. She did not ask for approval. She reported, as one reports to a silent board of directors, the decisions that had been made. He did not reply. She opened the schoolroom in October as she had said. She was the one who taught in it, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, until she could arrange something more permanent. She sat at the front of the room with 7 children ranging from 5 to 12, their faces serious and their attention fierce. And she taught them letters and numbers and how to read a simple account book, because she had decided that knowing how money moved was not a luxury, even for a farmer's daughter. One of the children, a boy named Peter, 10 years old, with a serious brow and an aptitude for numbers that startled her, asked one morning, "Is the Duke ever here?" "Ma'am. He has business in London," Marian said. "Has he seen the garden?" Peter asked. "It looks very fine now." "He has not," Marian said. And then, because honesty felt important in a room full of children, she added, "But I think he will." She did not know why she was certain of that. But she was. The Duke returned in November, 1 year and 4 days after the wedding. He had not announced his arrival. He appeared at the door of the study that was now organized, the ledgers straight. The receipts filed by month in a box she had made by covering an old hat box with gray linen, and found his wife at the desk, writing a letter in a hand both clear and rapid. With the particular posture of someone who had not thought to sit up straight because no one was watching. She did not startle. She looked up, and her expression was exactly what he had not expected, composed. Not surprised, not frightened, not even especially pleased. Simply present. "Your Grace," she said. "I see you have made use of the study," he said. "I have," she said. "I hope it serves." He looked around the room. The ledgers. The organized shelves. The pale winter light coming through windows that had been cleaned since he last stood here. He had come expecting, he had not been entirely clear on what he expected. Some version of the scene he had left behind. The disorder. The cold. The silent house. "Mrs. Granger tells me the roof has been repaired," he said. "The east wing." "Yes. Before the autumn rains. And the schoolroom has been reopened. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings. There are 7 children currently enrolled." He said nothing for a moment. He was still in his traveling coat, dust on the shoulders, and he had the look of a man who has walked into a room and realized the floor has been moved slightly to the left, not dangerously. Not unpleasantly, but undeniably. "I wrote to you," Marian said. 3 times. I received the letters. You did not reply." "No," he said. "I did not." The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had passed between them. She held his gaze without anger, without apology. And he understood, in that particular way that proud men understand things they have tried not to understand, that he was standing in a house that no longer required him. "I will have Mrs. Granger prepare the Duke's rooms," Marian said finally. She returned to her letter. He remained in the doorway for 1 moment longer, and then he went. Dinner that evening was a formal exercise. They sat at opposite ends of the dining table, the dining room now in regular use, the candles lit. A simple meal but a proper one, and they were polite to one another in the way of two people who know there is a great deal to be said and have not yet decided how much of it is safe. He asked about the tenants. She answered in detail, names and amounts and which families had been visited and which repairs were still outstanding. He listened without interrupting, and she noticed that his eyes, which she had once thought merely cold, were in fact attentive, the eyes of a man who was actually hearing what she said. Not waiting for her to stop. "You managed all of this yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "I had Mrs. Granger," she said. "And Thomas, in the garden. And eventually the village women. But the decisions were yours. Someone had to make them," she said. Simply. Without accusation. He was quiet for the rest of the meal. He stayed. This was itself the first surprise. She had assumed the visit would be brief, a week, perhaps two, the obligatory inspection of a property he considered more investment than home. But November became December, and the Duke of Ashfern remained at the manor, and Marian began to understand that something had shifted in his calculation. He was not easy to live with. He was accustomed to silence on his own terms, and the schoolroom voices on Tuesday and Thursday mornings appeared to disturb him, though he said nothing. He rode out each day on the estate roads, she watched him from the upstairs windows sometimes, and returned in the early afternoon with mud on his boots and something unresolved in his posture. He came to her one morning in the garden, where she was directing the winter pruning of the roses along the south wall. "Lord Fenwick has been at the western boundary again," he said. "His steward left marks on the fence posts. It is the third time." "I know," she said. She did not stop pruning. "You know. Thomas mentioned it in September. And again in October." She moved to the next section of rose cane. "Lord Fenwick has been pressing the boundary question for some time. He believes the north field was incorrectly allocated in the original survey." He looked at her. "How do you know about the original survey?" "There is a copy in the estate library," she said. "Third shelf from the left, behind the agricultural pamphlets. The surveyor's notation on the north corner is ambiguous, but the enclosure record from 1803 is quite clear. The field belongs to Ashfern." He was quiet. "I had thought to address it formally in the spring," she continued. "If Fenwick presses further, we have sufficient documentation. But an informal conversation before then might prevent the unpleasantness of a legal proceeding." She heard him exhale. It was not quite a laugh, and it was not quite admiration, and it was not quite anything she had heard from him before. "You should have been an estate manager," he said. "I am an estate manager," she said. "I simply wasn't hired for the role." He left the garden. But the following day he rode to Fenwick's house himself, and when he returned he told her, with a brevity that she was beginning to read as his version of relief, that the matter had been resolved. They began to speak more. Not warmly, not yet, but with the particular quality of two people who have discovered that the other person is not what they assumed. He asked questions and listened to the answers. She answered without performing, without softening her opinions for his comfort, and she noticed that he seemed to prefer it that way. He did not want to be managed. He wanted to be spoken to directly, and she found this was something she could do. One evening in December, snow falling soft against the drawing-room windows, she was reading when he came in and sat down without ceremony. He picked up the agricultural pamphlet she had left on the table and began to read it, and they sat in silence together for an hour, and the silence was, for the first time, something other than absence. But she did not forget. She could not forget. She had sat alone in a cold room in a wedding gown for a year, and she had built something from that aloneness. And she was not going to dismantle it simply because a man had decided to return and sit in her drawing room. She was not going to make it easy for him. Christmas came to Ashfern for the first time in what Mrs. Granger said was 4 years. Marian had not planned it as a significant gesture. She had simply decided that the house was warm enough now, the accounts sufficient, and the children would benefit from the customary festivities. She arranged a small gathering for the tenant families in the hall on Christmas Eve, a tradition apparently discontinued during the first Duchess's illness and never resumed. The Duke found her in the kitchen the day before Christmas, helping to arrange the baskets of provisions for the families. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene, the kitchen warm and bright, Agnes laughing at something, Mrs. Granger directing the arrangement of pudding with an authority that for once looked like pleasure, and his expression was something Marian had not seen before on his face. Not coldness, not assessment. Something older and quieter than both. My mother used to do this, he said, so quietly she was not entirely sure he had meant to speak aloud. She looked at him. Did she? Every year until she died. He was looking at the baskets, not at Marian. I was 12 when she died. The tradition stopped with her. She said nothing. She had learned, was still learning, that he did not respond well to sympathy, that sympathy made him close like a window in a storm. So instead she handed him a basket. Third family on the Eastern Road, she said. They have 4 children. The youngest is named Eliza and she has a very decided preference for dried fruit. He took the basket without a word. He went. He did not come back until the evening was nearly over, and when he did, Peter, the boy with the aptitude for numbers, was walking beside him. Talking in the earnest and exhausting way of 10-year-old boys, and the Duke was listening with an expression that might have been, on another man, warmth. That night, after the families had gone home and the house was quiet again, Marian sat by the fire in the drawing room and permitted herself to feel something she had been careful not to feel before. Not love. She was not careless enough for that yet. But something in the neighborhood of it, something that frightened her in the way that good things frighten people who had been given bad ones instead. She heard him come in. He sat in his chair. The fire spoke. My first wife, he said at last, without preamble, died in childbed. The child with her. His voice was even, the way a voice is even when a person has rehearsed evenness for years. I had not been kind to her in the months before. I was away more than I was present. I told myself it was estate business. Parliamentary business. I had reasons. Marian did not move. When I came home and found her gone, he said, I understood that the reasons had been fear. I was afraid of caring too much for something I might lose. He looked at the fire. I married you with the intention of repeating the arrangement. No caring. No loss. She was quiet for a long moment. That was not a kindness, she said. To me. No, he said. It was not. I wrote to you 3 times, she said. And you did not answer. And I built all of this alone, and I will not pretend that it did not hurt. He met her eyes across the fire. I know, he said. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said in 12 months of marriage. The letter arrived from London in January, and it carried the kind of news that arrives at the worst possible moment. It was from the Duke's solicitor. A second letter, tucked inside, bore the seal of a court of equity. A challenge had been made to the Ashfern estate deed, a challenge brought by Lord Fenwick's solicitor, claiming that the irregular survey notation constituted grounds for a formal boundary claim over the North Field and, attached to that, a right-of-way through the Western Estate Road that, if granted, would effectively divide Ashfern in 2. The Duke came to Marian's study with both letters. He laid them on her desk without comment. She read them twice. Her face did not change, but her hand pressed flat against the desk in a way he had begun to recognize as her version of composure under pressure. The enclosure record of 1803, she said. Yes. We will need the original, not the estate copy. It would be held at the county record office. I know. We will also need a statement from Thomas about the long-standing use of the Western Road by Ashfern tenant families. That establishes continuous use, which weakens Fenwick's right-of-way claim significantly. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her. You have already thought about this. I have thought about it since October, she said. I hoped it would not come to this. Will you come with me to London, he asked. To meet with the solicitor. She looked up. You know the documents better than I do, he said. You know the estate better than I do. It was the plainest acknowledgement he had made, and it required something from him that she could see was not easy, not the asking, but the meaning behind it. That he needed her. That she was not decorative or incidental but necessary. Yes, she said. I will come. London was cold and grey and smelled of coal smoke and ambition. And Marian sat in the solicitor's office in her best dress and spoke about enclosure records and survey notations and the documented history of tenant usage with such clarity and precision that the solicitor twice asked the Duke's permission to write down what she had said. And twice the Duke said, "She requires no permission from me. Write what she tells you." Fenwick's claim was insufficient. The solicitor was confident. But confidence in law and outcomes in law were not the same thing, and on the carriage ride back to Ashfern, through a landscape gone white and still with heavy snowfall, Marian sat with her hands in her lap and felt the peculiar exhaustion of fighting for something you had not asked to protect. The Duke sat across from her in the rocking carriage and said nothing for a long time. The snow came harder. The road became uncertain. The coachman slowed. Then stopped. The road ahead was drifted over, a wall of white where the lane bent through a cutting between two fields. They could not pass. Night was 2 hours away. The nearest farmhouse was half a mile back through open country. "We go back to the farmhouse," Marian said. "The horse cannot manage in this, on foot," she said. "One of us leads the near horse, one keeps the coachman moving." She was already wrapping her cloak tighter, her voice calm and practical, and he looked at her, her plain, clear, steady face, and thought, "I have been a fool." Not abstractly. Specifically, precisely, and without excuse. They made it to the farmhouse. The farmer's wife gave them a room above the kitchen, and Marian sat on the edge of a narrow bed in her damp cloak and laughed, a single, exhausted, surprised sound, and the Duke sat beside her and heard in that laugh something he had not earned but wanted very much to deserve. "We will be the subject of extraordinary gossip," he said. "We were already married," she said. "I don't think it can get worse." He looked at her in the candlelight, and what he saw was not the girl he had taken no notice of in November of the previous year. He saw a woman who had carried an estate on her back for 12 months. Who had organized his papers and taught his tenants' children and stood in a solicitor's office in London and spoken with more authority than most men he had sat beside in Parliament. He had left her alone in a cold room. She had built a home. "Marian," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him. Her expression was careful. She had not forgotten. He could see that she had not forgotten, and he understood that this was correct, that he should not have been forgiven easily. "I know I do not deserve anything from you," he said. "I know I have not earned it. But I would like," he stopped. Started again. "I would like to try to deserve it. If you will allow me to." She looked at the candle for a moment. "You may continue," she said. The echo of his own words, spoken in a doorway a year ago, asking to enter a room that was legally already his, was not lost on either of them. She had turned them back on him, gently, precisely, and with a grace that he had done nothing to merit. He nodded. He did not take her hand that night. But he did not leave, and in the morning, when the snow had settled and the road was passable, they rode back to Ashfern together. And for the first time it felt like they were riding home to the same place. Spring returned to Ashfern in its careful way, the elms leafing again, the kitchen garden beginning its industrious second year. Fenwick's legal claim was dismissed in March, the enclosure record of 1803 having proved exactly as decisive as Marian had believed it would. Thomas, fully recovered now, planted the north field without ceremony, and Marian stood at the window of her study and watched and felt something that was simply, quietly, right. The Duke had kept his word. He had not swept in and replaced what she had built with his own preferences. He had learned the names of the children in the schoolroom, and he had contributed, without announcement, a set of reading primers and a proper globe from London. He had sat through 2 tenant meetings without speaking more than necessary, which was the right amount, and on the question of the permanent schoolroom teacher. He had asked Marian what she thought before offering any opinion of his own. He was learning. It was not graceful, and it was not easy, and there were days when old habits rose up in him like weather, the withdrawal, the silence that was different from contemplation. The way he could be present in body and completely absent otherwise. On those days she did not chase him. She let him be, and eventually he came back, and sometimes he came back carrying the small specific items that she had come to understand were his form of apology, a book she had mentioned. The good candles for the study, a length of wool from town in a blue she had once said she liked. She was not soft with him. She never became soft. But she became, gradually and deliberately, more open. The way a garden becomes more open to rain as the soil improves, not because the rain has changed but because the ground has learned to receive it. There was one evening in April that she would mark in her memory as the evening things finally shifted into something she could name. They were walking along the lane after dinner, the last light still in the sky above the elms, and he stopped quite suddenly and turned to look back at the manor. The windows were lit, the drawing room, the kitchen, the upper hall, and in the warm rectangles of light she could see the shape of the house as it had become, not ruined, not silent, not abandoned. Inhabited. Full. "I have been offered the parliamentary seat for the Northern District," he said. "My cousin has pressed the matter for some time." "Would it require London most of the year?" she asked. "It would." She waited. "I declined," he said. He was still looking at the house. "I wrote last week. I told them my estate required my attention." She looked at his profile in the evening light. "You love this house," she said. It was not a question, but it was a realization, and she heard it in her own voice as she said it. "I didn't know I did," he said. "Until I came back and found it alive." He turned to look at her then. "Until I found you in it." She held his gaze. "I left you here in November with a cold fire and a locked room of disordered accounts," he said, "and I told myself I was being practical. Honorable, even. That I was sparing you from false expectations." He shook his head. "I was a coward. I was afraid, and I dressed it in duty, and I left you alone in a house that needed everything." "It did need everything," she said. "And you gave it everything." "I had nothing else to do," she said, but she was almost smiling as she said it. And he saw the smile, and something in his chest moved in the manner of a door that has been closed a long time and is finally, carefully, opened. "May I ask you something?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You may continue," she said again, and this time he heard it for what it was, a gift she was giving him. An answer to the question he had asked in the wrong form a year ago and was only now asking properly. "Will you let me be your husband?" he said. "Not in law. I know I am that already. Not in name. I know I have that too. Will you let me be your husband in the way that it is meant, in this house, in this life, that you have made?" She looked at him for a long moment. The light was nearly gone from the sky. The first lamp had appeared in the schoolroom window, Agnes, locking up for the night. "I have conditions," she said. He very nearly smiled. "I would expect nothing less. The schoolroom continues, properly funded and staffed. The tenant accounts remain in my management. And you do not disappear to London without first telling me when you intend to return." "And I will return," he said quietly. "Each time. I will always return." She looked at the house. She looked at the man beside her, who was in so many ways a stranger still. And yet had begun, in the way of all things built slowly and with intention, to feel like something she had always known would eventually stand here. "Then yes," she said. "You may." He took her hand. It was the first time, and he held it with the particular care of a man who knows he is holding something he does not deserve and has decided to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. They walked back to the house together. The lane smelled of new earth and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the early blossoms on the rose canes along the south wall, the ones she had pruned herself last December, in the cold. Because she believed they would bloom. They did. The door of Ashfern Manor opened before them, warm light spilling out, and the house received them in the way a home receives people who belong in it, without ceremony, without condition. Simply and completely. If this story moved you, if Marian's quiet courage or the Duke's long return home touched something in your heart, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you longest. Share this story with someone who loves a romance that takes its time, that earns every tender word. And if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please do. We bring new stories of love, dignity, and hard-won happiness every week. This is what romance was always meant to be, not the fall, but the rising. Not the door left open, but the one finally, gently, walked through together.